If you picture medieval war as non-stop sword fights and heroic charges, you're seeing the least common part. Most campaigns were decided by the unglamorous stuff: how much food you could move, where your horses could graze, whether the roads and bridges would hold, and how long you could keep paying people before they went home. A small medieval army could burn through supplies faster than a town could replace them, so commanders spent more time thinking about grain stores, wagons, and river routes than battlefield speeches. That's why so many wars turned into sieges, raids on farmland, and fights over crossings and supply lines. Movies love the moment of impact. Real medieval warfare was mostly about whether you could stay alive, organized, and fed long enough for that moment to even happen. Number 1. The bottleneck. When people say medieval warfare was 90% logistics, they're basically saying this: the hardest part wasn't swinging a sword, it was keeping an army alive, moving, and paid long enough to do anything useful. In medieval Europe, most rulers couldn't just gather a huge force and keep it in the field indefinitely, because every extra day meant more food, more animals, more wagons, more money, and more problems. A force that looks small in a movie, say a few thousand soldiers, could already be a nightmare to supply. Even if each person only needs a modest daily ration, you're still talking about several tons of food and drink every single day, once you include the people who cook, repair gear, drive wagons, and handle animals. And if you add cavalry, the math gets brutal fast, because horses eat more by weight than humans do. So medieval commanders weren't just thinking, where is the enemy? They were thinking, where can we march without starving? Where can we find fodder? Where are the roads? And how long until our supplies run out? That's why campaigns often followed rivers, stuck to fertile regions, or aimed at places where food could be gathered. It also explains why armies didn't always sprint straight toward a decisive battle. Sometimes the best move was to avoid a fight until the enemy's supply situation got worse than yours. The famous clashes are what gets remembered, but behind them is a steady grind of planning routes, collecting grain, guarding supply carts, and making sure the army doesn't dissolve before the fighting even starts, which naturally leads straight into the most basic question every medieval army had to answer. What exactly are we feeding all these people? Number 2. Feeding the army. A medieval army ran on calories that were easy to carry and hard to spoil. Bread, grain, beans, peas, cheese, salted or smoked meat, dried fish in some regions, and whatever local food could be bought or taken along the route. Fresh meat is heavy and spoils fast, so preserved food mattered a lot, and salt was strategic for a reason. Grain was the backbone because it stores well and turns into bread or porridge almost anywhere if you have mills, ovens, fuel, and time. That's a big if, because an army on the move can't rely on a nice bakery waiting for it. They brought bakers, portable ovens in some cases, and lots of basic cooking gear, but fuel was always a constraint. Even boiling a pot all day means you need firewood, and firewood is heavy, and cutting it takes time. Water is another issue that movies rarely treat seriously. Clean water wasn't guaranteed, and armies knew that bad water could wreck a camp. In many places, low-alcohol beer or ale was a practical drink because it kept better than untreated water and was safer than a random stream near a busy road. Then there's the question of who provides the food. Sometimes it was purchased from merchants following the army. Sometimes it was gathered from estates and towns under obligation. Sometimes it was taken by force, which is basically logistics by violence, and it comes with consequences. Locals hide supplies, roads become dangerous, and resentment turns into resistance. Commanders had to balance speed, discipline, and supply, because a hungry army becomes an army that steals, and an army that steals becomes harder to control. And once food for the people is barely manageable, cavalry shows up and makes everything more complicated. Number 3. Horses change everything. Knights look like the main event in medieval war stories, but the real story is often the horse. A mounted force is fast and powerful, but it's also a moving supply crisis. A war horse and even a basic riding horse needs a lot of fodder: hay, grass, oats, barley, plus clean water. You can carry some grain for horses, but hay is bulky, and grazing depends on season and location. That means the landscape is basically making decisions for the commander. Wet ground, poor pasture, or a burned countryside can slow cavalry down or force it onto specific routes. On top of that, horses don't just need food. They need farriers, nails, shoes, leather tack, spare straps, and constant care. If your horses go lame, your elite troops turn into slow infantry and your scouting collapses. That's why medieval armies paid huge attention to where the animals would feed and rest. It's also why the classic idea of knights charging all day, every day, is unrealistic. You can't spam cavalry the way movies do if your fodder situation is shaky. This is one reason you see lots of mounted men still fighting on foot in many battles. Sometimes it's tactically smart, and sometimes it's because you're managing limited horse resources and saving their strength for when it really matters. Cavalry also increases the size of the baggage train because you need more gear, more specialists, more spare parts, and often more servants. So, when a medieval commander chose to bring a lot of mounted troops, they weren't just choosing a style of combat. They were choosing a whole logistics profile that shaped how far they could go, how quickly they could move, and how long they could stay. Which raises the next question: who's paying for all of this? Number 4. Money, contracts, and time limits. A medieval army isn't just raised, it's financed. Even when service is technically owed by feudal obligation, there are usually limits, time limits, distance limits, or conditions. In many places and periods, a noble might owe a fixed number of days of service, and after that, the ruler needs to negotiate, pay, or find another method. That's one reason medieval warfare shifts over time toward paid troops, retinues, and hired specialists. Sieges, engineers, crossbowmen, archers, artillery crews in the late period. These roles don't fit neatly into a short feudal calendar, so rulers relied on cash payments, contracts, and systems for gathering revenue. Taxes, loans, ransoms, confiscations, and deals with towns. And paying troops isn't optional in a practical sense. If wages don't show up, discipline collapses. Soldiers drift away, or they pay themselves from the countryside, which then creates political problems and makes local supply even worse. There's also the problem of the payment format. Medieval economies were coin-based in many areas, but not always in convenient denominations, and moving large amounts of coin is heavy and risky. That's why credit arrangements and financiers matter more than people expect. If you can't move money safely, you can't keep a force together for long. Even the act of mustering, getting the army to gather at the right time and place, depends on planning and administration. Lists of who owes service, where they're supposed to meet, what equipment they must bring, and how they'll be inspected. In other words, logistics isn't just wagons and bread, it's paperwork and timing. And once you've assembled this expensive, temporary machine, you immediately run into the next challenge: moving it without it falling apart. Number 5. Roads, rivers, and the baggage train. Medieval movement is limited by terrain, infrastructure, and the slowest element in the column. Armies usually can't march like a modern highway convoy. Roads can be muddy tracks, bridges can be fragile, and a heavy wagon can get stuck or break an axle at the worst moment. That's why pack animals, mules and horses, often mattered as much as wagons. Pack trains are flexible, but they still need food and handlers. The result is that an army's tail can be huge. Carts with food, barrels, tents, tools, spare weapons, cooking gear, and sometimes siege equipment, plus non-combatants who keep the army functioning. A medieval army on the move is less like a neat rectangle of fighters, and more like a long, messy system that can stretch for miles. That matters tactically, because an enemy doesn't have to defeat your front line to hurt you. They can hit your baggage, cut your scouts off, or seize a bridge ahead of you, and suddenly your whole force has to stop and fix the problem. This is also why rivers and coastlines are a big deal. Moving bulk supplies by water is often easier than dragging them over bad roads, so campaigns frequently stick close to navigable rivers or coordinate with ships. If you can supply by boat, you can keep larger forces in the field, and you can support sieges longer. March speed is another reality check. A typical pace might be in the range of a dozen to 20 miles a day, depending on conditions, and less if you're moving heavy equipment or trying to forage on the way. Fast raids exist, but a major army doesn't teleport. So commanders had to plan around choke points, bridges, fords, mountain passes, and around where the next meal is coming from. Once you see that, it's easier to understand why medieval strategy often looks indirect on a map, and why information becomes part of logistics, not a separate topic. Number 6, foraging, scouting, and choices that look weird. A medieval commander constantly had to decide between carrying supplies, arranging supply points, buying locally, or living off the land. Carrying more means slower movement. Buying locally depends on cooperation and cash. Living off the land is fast and sometimes unavoidable, but it can also turn the population against you, and it can strip the region so thoroughly that you can't come back through it later. This is one reason raids and destructive campaigns show up so much in medieval warfare. A fast-moving force can burn crops, seize livestock, and wreck mills and barns, not just to be cruel, but to attack the enemy's ability to feed troops and to collect revenue. If you can't pay or feed an army, you can't keep one. That kind of pressure can force an opponent into a battle they didn't want, or force them to negotiate. Scouting ties directly into this. You're not only scouting for the enemy's knights, you're scouting for food sources, usable roads, intact bridges, safe water, and defensible campsites. Messengers, local guides, and intelligence from towns and monasteries can be more valuable than a flashy battlefield hero. And because communication is slow, logistics planning has to be conservative. If your supply carts are 2 days behind and the bridge ahead is out, you need options immediately, not a perfect plan that depends on everything going right. That's why medieval commanders care so much about controlling towns, river crossings, and fortified points. They aren't just tactical positions, they're nodes in the supply network. It also explains why an army might spend weeks capturing a minor castle or securing a road junction. If that point controls movement and resupply, it's not minor. This all sets the stage for the most common kind of medieval fighting, which isn't the open field battle at all, but the siege. Number 7. Sieges were logistics wars. If you picture medieval warfare as mostly big battles, you're missing what most campaigns actually looked like. Taking and holding territory usually meant dealing with fortified places, castles, walled towns, and strong points guarding roads and rivers. Battles happened, but sieges were often the main event, and sieges are basically logistics contests with weapons attached. The defender tries to store enough food and water to outlast the attacker. The attacker tries to cut those supplies and keep their own army fed long enough to make the defense crack. That means the attacker needs steady deliveries of grain, firewood, tools, and sometimes building materials. Even a simple siege requires a ton of work. Digging trenches, building earthworks, making ladders, building shelters, maintaining watch rotations, and keeping disease under control in a crowded camp. Engineers and craftsmen matter a lot here. Carpenters, masons, miners, rope makers, smiths. Ammunition is another overlooked piece. Arrows and crossbow bolts are consumed fast. Rulers placed massive orders for them because a serious campaign could burn through huge stockpiles. In the later Middle Ages, artillery adds another supply chain: powder ingredients, shot, spare parts, and specialists who know how to operate and repair the guns. And even if you have the machines, the clock is still ticking. A besieging army is sitting in one place eating the surrounding area. As supplies run out locally, your supply line has to reach farther, which makes it easier to attack. So a defender doesn't always need a heroic sortie. Sometimes they just need to hold on until weather, hunger, or money forces the besieger to leave. That's why relief armies and the threat of a relief army are so powerful. The attacker has to feed themselves and also be ready to fight someone coming to break the siege, which brings the whole story back to the boring but decisive reality: maintenance, replacement, and the constant keeping it running work that movies skip. Number 8. The unglamorous jobs that decide outcomes. A medieval army only works because a lot of people are doing jobs that don't look cinematic. Someone has to repair armor straps, sharpen edges, fletch arrows, fix wagon wheels, shoe horses, stitch tents, and keep cooking gear usable. Leather rots, wood breaks, metal rusts, and boots wear out. If your soldiers can't march because their shoes are gone, the campaign is over no matter how brave they are. If your horses lose shoes or get sick, your scouting and mobility collapse. If your bowstrings get wet and you don't have replacements protected from rain, your missile troops lose effectiveness. Even basic camp organization matters. Where waste goes, how food is stored, how water is collected, how fires are managed, how crowded the camp is. Armies learned the hard way that sickness could spread fast and ruin a force without any enemy attack. Weather is a logistics multiplier too. Mud can slow wagons to a crawl, floods can cut roads, and early winter can end a campaign simply by making feeding animals too difficult. None of this means medieval soldiers didn't fight hard or that tactics didn't matter. It means tactics sit on top of a supply system, and the supply system sets the boundaries of what's even possible. Battles often happen when one side feels forced because their supplies are running low, because their pay is late, because they're stuck far from food, or because a strategic point they need for movement is about to be lost. Once you watch medieval warfare through that lens, a lot of strange decisions start to make sense. Avoiding battle, targeting barns and mills, hugging rivers, fighting over bridges, camping in certain places, and spending weeks on a fortress that looks irrelevant on a modern map. The fight on the day is what gets the legend, but the campaign is usually decided by whether the army could keep eating, moving, and staying together long enough for that day to even happen.